Okay, reading from idebate.org here. The debate topic: this House believes that the United Nations has failed. Okay, here we go. The United Nations was formed out of the horrors of the Second World War with the overarching purpose of preventing this kind of total war from ever happening again. Its formation came after the failures of the League of Nations, an international organization that had the same lofty goal of preventing war. The UN sought to overcome the League's failures by embedding itself into all aspects of the international community, setting up organizations such as the General Assembly, Security Council, International Court of Justice, the World Bank, and later on the International Atomic Energy Agency and its development program. Over the last 60 years, the UN has changed and developed. Along the way, it has permanently changed the environment of the international community through its work in peacekeeping, creating and developing international law, the establishment of human rights. The list goes on. However, in all this change, some negatives have arisen. The decision-making process is often very slow, and many institutions like the Security Council are reactionary and very easily caught up in power politics, rendering them useless at critical moments. This raises the question that this debate is focused around: has the UN failed? Okay, let's look at some points and counterpoints. Point: it is clearly unrealistic to imagine that the United Nations could prevent all wars, but nonetheless, it has been successful at negotiating peaceful resolutions to international disputes. It has also authorized military force to defend countries from unprovoked attacks. Kuwait and South Korea, to name just two, owe their freedom to UN action. Finally, UN peacekeepers do vital work all over the world, from Cyprus to Korea. Counterpoint: no one is suggesting that the test of a successful United Nations should be an end to all armed conflict. But even judged on its own criteria, it has been remarkably ineffectual. The examples of Kuwait and Korea are both situations where defensive wars were fought by the US and allies for their own reasons. The containment of Saddam Hussein and communism, respectively, are not UN ideals. Where the UN did not authorize military action, such as in Vietnam or Iraq in 2003, this made no difference. It is hard to think of an example where imminent conflict was definitely averted due to UN influence. As for UN peacekeepers, they usually come into conflicts only after they have ended and thousands of civilians been killed. They often do a good job, but they are seldom indispensable. Other regional organizations such as NATO or the African Union can equally well perform this function. Point. When the United Nations was founded in 1945, the idea of international law, or insofar as it had any meaning, was little more than the customary behaviour of states towards each other. Over the succeeding 60 years, the UN and its various offices and organs have taken a lead role in codifying and promoting the concept of international law and the protection of human rights. For example, the crime of genocide was first enshrined in international law in the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Counterpoint. The UN has been only one among many organisations which have shaped the modern doctrine of international law. More influential in developing our contemporary understanding of human rights, arguably, was the worldwide horror at the Holocaust, Nuremberg war crimes trials, and the determination of the West to hold developing nations and communist states to the same standards that they, supposedly, adhere to. When activists in undemocratic regimes fight for better civil rights, it is seldom the UN they cite as their model. It is fair to ascribe the United Nations its due share of credit for this emerging consensus, but it has been remarkably bad at actually encouraging, let alone enforcing, the rules it has helped to create. Point. The United Nations is far more than simply a debating forum. It does a massive amount of vital work around the world through its other organs. Examples of these are the World Health Organization, UNESCO, UNICEF, the International Court of Justice, and the High Commissioner for Refugees, among many others. Even if the slow speed of diplomacy at the UN General Assembly can sometimes be frustrating, the idea that the United Nations as a whole has failed simply does not take account of all these very important bodies. Furthermore, the UN remains one of the most respected of international organizations among ordinary citizens. Counterpoint. It is obviously true that some UN agencies and organs carry out valuable and useful work. However, there are two ways of looking at this. The first is that UN work often duplicates programs and programs carried out by NGOs, national governments, and charities. Its work is useful, but by no means indispensable. The second way of approaching this question is to ask whether these are core functions of the UN. In other words, whether preserving world heritage or coordinating vaccination programs is what the UN is really for. We can admit that some UN agencies do good work, but still believe that as a body overall, the United Nations has failed. Point. It is undeniably true that some of the UN's procedures need to be improved, and standards of financial transparency improved. However, this is true of many governments and international organizations, not just the UN. The answer to the UN's problems is not to give up on it, but rather reform it for the 21st century, including perhaps changing or augmenting the permanent membership of the Security Council to reflect the reality of the modern world. Counterpoint. This debate is about whether or not the UN has failed. It may well be that the response to a failing organisation is not abolition but wholesale reform, as the opposition argue here. But that would not change the fact that the UN has not achieved what it was designed to do. And while reform has been promised for many decades, nothing has ever been done to resolve the systemic flaws of the organisation. So, promises of reform are unsatisfactory answers to the charges against the UN. Point. In a globalized economy, nations depend on each other as never before, and the costs of war and conflict grow ever higher. So it is more important than ever that countries have a forum for resolving their disputes and simply talking to each other. Regional bodies such as the EU or the ASEAN can perform some of these functions, and specialised bodies such as the WTO some others. But there can never be a substitute for the global forum provided by the UN. If the United Nations did not exist, we would have to invent it. Counterpoint. It is arguable that the era of globalization makes the United Nations less important, not more. Trade disputes are settled bilaterally or through the WTO. Economic crisis through the offices of the World Bank and IMF. Security problems, as often as not, through the mediation of the US or other interested powers. All too often, the UN is a forum not for dispute resolution, but the airing of grievances against other nations. For example, in the run-up to the 2003 Iraq War, both the United States and its detractors, such as France, used the UN to publicize and justify their position on military action, not to discuss it in any meaningful way. If a United Nations did not exist, and we were obliged to invent one, we would hopefully do a better job next time. Okay, visit the site idebate.org if you'd like to see the other points and counterpoints in this debate, or just check the site out in general, because it's really well worth a look. Anyway, folks, hope you all have a lovely day, and I will see you next video.